Welcome to Pizza Quest. I'm Peter Reinhardt. Those of you who listen to Heritage Radio Network already know our next guest. He's got the longest running podcast on the network, Jimmy Carbone. He's the New York-based restaurateur, dedicated social entrepreneur, an event producer, and in addition to owning Jimmy's Number 43, an East Village bar and restaurant with a focus on unique beers and green market menu, Jimmy co-founded the Good Beer Seal, which exists to identify bars offering an intriguing selection of craft beer in a unique atmosphere created by owner-operators who exhibit a deep commitment. That's the key, the deep commitment not only to the promotion of craft beer, but to their community as well. Jimmy launched Beer Sessions Radio in early 2010, and more than 15 years later, Beer Sessions Radio is the longest continuously running show on Heritage Radio Network. Jimmy's a co-author of I Like Pig, Recipes and Inspirations from New York City's Pig Island. Jimmy, we're going to talk about that in a minute, which was a finalist for an IACP Cookbook Award. Jimmy's also founder of Food Karma Projects, a creative producer of food and media events throughout the New York area. So, host of Beer Sessions, Jimmy Carbone, welcome to Pizza Quest, and thanks for joining us.
Well, Peter, it's so great to be talking with you on your show. You know, the minute Pizza Quest came online on Heritage Radio Network 5 years ago, I was like, wow, this is a great show, great idea, and I can't wait to be on. So thanks for having me.
Well, you invited me on yours, so I got to talk with you on your show on Beer Sessions. We talked about beer and pizza, and today we want to talk about, I know that you recently had a guest on who was an expert on ciders, apple ciders, hard ciders. And I love those. In some ways, I like hard ciders almost more than beer even, although it's sometimes hard to draw the line between the two. So we thought today I'm going to have you share with me and with our listeners some of the things you learned from the cider side of things, as well as the beer side. And, and hear a little bit about your story. I mean, you've been doing this for 15 years. Some people know a lot about you, but many people don't. So, Jimmy, and you take me through a tasting. I've got 3 ciders here. I want you to guide me through them. But before we get into those, can you talk a little bit about the journey you've been on for the last 15 or so years in creating Beer Sessions and the things that came before your restaurant, the nonprofit work that you're doing, and your book? I want to hear about I Like Pig.
Well, I grew up I'm actually in my hometown today. I'm in a cafe called Battlegrounds Coffee in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Just north.
We can hear a little bit of the background.
And, I had a pretty eclectic Italian family where food was number one. And my different aunts and grandmothers were from different parts of Italy, from, Genoa, Liguria in the north, to Abruzzo in the mountains, and Campania in the south. So I grew up, I felt like I grew up with the best culinary education we could have had, as well as where we live. We're always near fresh seafood. And at the time, there were a lot of small farms up here. So I kind of was primed. I knew what good food was when I was a little kid. And I got to go to New York because I went to school. I was a decent enough student to get into Columbia University. Went to New York, and it was about 10 years process of learning how to live on my own. And the number one issue was finding a good lunch. I know you have your quest story. And this all started with, wow, I could not go into the school cafeteria. Even when I was a kid, my mother made my lunch almost every day until high school. I used to swap when I was in 5th grade with the American kid, Jimmy Owens. And I would bring in an extra whatever I had. If it was pizza, extra finger raviolis, I would give him half, and then he would give me his Drake's American apple pie. And I thought that was a huge deal. And so early on, I learned that there was value in Italian food. And, I got to bum around, hitchhike. I was in a lot of places. I was on trucks in Turkey, and I went behind the Iron Curtain in 1983, which is a long time ago. And at every stop, I had a simple meal. And so by the time I finished school, I was going to be an architect. I just couldn't take being in an office. And I worked in a restaurant. And the next thing I know, I was buying the wine. And because I was buying the wine, I started cooking. And I wanted to pair the different wines I had. So that was over 30 years ago. And then the next thing I know, I found a restaurant that was closed in the East Village, and I opened it. It was called Mugsy's Chow Chow. And that was my real quest, because once I got to that point, I had to learn how to cook. I had to learn how to run a place. It was a small place. It was a great, so that's my love. This will lead me to why I like cider. The number one reason I opened a place was I love hosting people. I love hospitality. But by being in industry, having a wine license, I was able. Let me just, interact with the knowledge of the people that sell wine and spirits and beer in New York in particular. Is every single one of them is an expert. So my education was tasting with wines and craft beers as they came out, and fine spirits, and that was my job. And so I got to cook and run the restaurant, and that paid the bills. But I got to dive right in, and I remember I was really proud. After a few years, there was a club that you had to prove that you had tasted 100 different grapes. And with wine, we'll get into beer and cider, but with wine, if you keep track of all the wines you had in the traditional regions, France and Italy, every single wine you've tried has at least 3 or 4 grapes in there. So, within half an hour, I realized I tasted probably 200 grapes in my life at that point. And, that's really what kept me in the industry, was working with these great suppliers and recs. So I love food. I love farms. I love chefs, but number one, I'm a drinks guy. And, yeah, it'd be fun to react where,
Before you go on the drink side, Jimmy, let me ask you something before you, the Chow Chow Cafe or whatever, what did you call it? Your place?
Mugsy's Chow Chow.
Mugsy's Chow
Yeah.
Chow. What kind of food did you serve there? It sounds like what you created was kind of like a salon for you to just hang out with cool people and fun people and learn from them.
Yeah, and it was that, and it was also, to learn how to cook, I had to go deep within myself and realize, what did I know? What tastes did I know?
Yeah.
So it was Italian food. And my first cookbook I worked with was Marcello Hazan's book. And,
That was your guy.
mostly I was making very simple foods, but also the suppliers. It was like there was a really great fish distributor down the street, and every day I'd have 4 different fish. And I cooked fish, I cooked pasta, I made salads, and it was great education for me.
So,
And of course, we prepared all the drinks with it. So
is it still going?
no, that was it was 11. That was 12-year run. Including we expanded. I keep learning the whole business. It went from a small restaurant. At one point, I expanded, put in a bar next door. At another point, I brought in my first really great chef, Sarah Jenkins, who you may know. She had a place called Porcena. Now she's up in Maine at Nina June. Um, she was the one who would come in and taste my food and just kind of scowl at me. And she showed me how to make really simple sauces and things. And
It's funny
she
how
was the
many.
first chef I worked with. She went to the green market 5 days a week and hand wrote a menu, and that was in 2001 to 2002. And that was the dream come true, to work with a chef like that. And it really informed me. I always knew that going to farmers markets was better, but I'd never seen someone actually write a daily menu
Yeah,
based
and
on
that's when
what they got
that
to market.
that kind of farm to table, approach was just coming in vogue then. So you were kind of on trend. But isn't it amazing how many terrific chefs have ended up back in Maine? Maine is the hot spot right now, the happening place, it seems like.
For example, jumping ahead to cider, I now do a cider feast. This will be my second year. We do it on Mother's Day in Portland, and it's a great experience up there. When I'm in Portland, there'll be someone that works in a bakery who somehow used to go to one of my restaurants and knew me from New York, or there's someone up there who's I knew from a brewery that there's so many New York City to Portland, Maine connections in the food and drinks industry. It really is amazing. It's
Yeah,
it's like better than Brooklyn. I can say that.
It's the new Brooklyn is now the reference point for anything that's
Yeah.
doing hot. You know? So anyway, so you're learning as you're doing the restaurant, and then how did you get into doing a podcast? I mean, you've got the longest running podcast. You practically the podcast that Heritage Radio Network is built upon.
Oh, that's great. Thanks for saying that. It's built on all the great guests that I had at the time. I had another place I opened in 2005. It was called Jimmy's Number 43. And that was based in, and it had been a beer bar. It was connected to a couple legendary beer bars down the street from McSorley's Ale House. So you get the vibe. This was Beer Street, USA, right there. And so we were on the cutting edge of all the new breweries opening in America, with also a reverence for the classic European beers like Great Germans and Belgian beers.
Yeah.
So what happened with Jimmy's was that we met other indie-owned, small beer bars that were doing the same thing.
Yeah.
And one of my good buddies, Ray Dieter, I met him through a couple of tastings. He owned the DBA bar in Manhattan and in Brooklyn and in New Orleans. We talked about doing some joint promotions. And next thing you know, we created a group of beer bar owners called the Good Beer Seal. And about a year into that, I met Patrick Morton's, the founder of Heritage Radio Network. I went on a couple of his shows, and then I said, listen, I want to do a beer show. I've got a great co-host, Ray Dieter, who's a legend. And he knew everyone from the industry. And it was a really great way to start something different. And one thing, I don't know, you're a pro. I mean, you've been doing media and writing books and teaching for a long time. When we started, and it was March of 2010, I'd never done anything like it. And but my co-host was really charismatic. And we'd start with, hey, you're a homebrew enthusiast. Will you come on our show tonight? And the next thing you know, whatever beer rep was going to be at Ray's place or my place that week would suddenly be our guest. And it was the glory days, because we'd go to the studio at Roberta's Pizza way out in Bushwick, where most people hadn't really been yet. And we
before Bushwick was
Bushwick, beer industry networking experience.
That's right.
But also, it was the kind of place, talking about pizza, where it was an old auto repair shop, and they basically built it around they got one of those giant classic wood fired ovens from Italy. Well, they put it in there and they built the walls around it. So it was just a few years ago, they needed to replace the pizza oven. So what do they have to do? They closed for a day, knocked out one of the walls, took the old one out, brought the new one in, and rebuilt the wall.
And that's where the original studios where you guys did your first broadcasting came from the little studio right next to the restaurant.
Yeah. And so right up in,
again, Wi-Fi issue.
Yeah, right up through the pandemic. We were there almost 50 times a year for I don't know how many years.
Yeah, it's an amazing concept, because of course Heritage Radio Network has hosts now dozens and dozens of great food related podcasts like yours and ours. We're honored to be part of that group, and it's great also to be able to kind of collaborate with some of the other hosts, that I get to come on your show, you get to come on my show, because there's a wealth of talent there. And we want, we're going to be meeting up with some other hosts over time. And we've already done some with the cheese folks, and it's a great resource. So, but I think it's also kind of important that you've been running for 15 years. That's a long time. That's a long life for any show in any medium. So you must have over 700 or 800 episodes already in the can. You there? We keep intermittently losing Jimmy because of the connectivity issues with Wi-Fi. We'll see if we can get him back. In the meantime, while he's coming back, what I was trying to get at here is some of the interesting people that he's met doing as many shows as he's done. I mean, for 10 years, they got 500 episodes in. So now they've been 15 years. So I'm guessing somewhere around 700 episodes. There you are. You back? Can you hear me, Jim? So while we're waiting for Jimmy to come back in, for those of you who follow us but have not yet discovered Beer Sessions Radio with host Jimmy Carbone, just go to the Heritage Radio Network .org website, or just search it out, Heritage Radio Network, and then all the shows that are currently being produced are listed there, including Beer Sessions. You can go to the archives, see some of listen to some of their past episodes, as well as go to Pizza Quest on Heritage Radio, and you'll hear all the audio versions of our podcast. Some of our podcasts are simulcast on a video version that we do through our website and through YouTube. But we always put out an audio version as well for people that are, kind of on a bike or jogging or in a car and just want to listen to the conversation. And so essentially we've been running parallel tracks here. My quest for the perfect pizza is Pizza Quest, and Jimmy's quest for knowledge about all things beer and cider is Beer Sessions Radio. So,
You know,
are you back, Jimmy? I keep hearing him cutting in and then cutting out. So we're going to keep working on it. In the meantime, I'll tell you what we had planned for today, and hopefully we'll get to it. And if not, we'll re-log in and we'll splice the two together. But we decided that since he just had a cider show, and he loves ciders as much as I do, that I would get 3 ciders from my local market. Got them from Whole Foods. They got a nice ciders section there at Whole Foods in Charlotte, where I'm based, and I brought 3 of them with me. One is called Samuel Smith's Organic Cider. It comes from Great Britain. We've got one called Original Sin Black Widow Cider. So Original Sin is the brand, Black Widow Cider, and it's pressed with blackberries as well as, New York apple. So that's a New York cider. And the third one is called Potter's Craft Cider. And the particular cider, because they probably have more than one, is Petite Cider Potter's. And I'm not sure exactly let's see where Potter's comes from. Charlottesville, Virginia. So we're across the pond and we're on the East Coast. Now, where I used to live in California, we had California-based ciders, Ace Cider, and some of the early ones. I lived in apple country, but it was Gravenstein country. There weren't enough Gravensteins still left because most of those fields have been turned in, the orchards were turned into vineyards. But Gravenstein's a great apple for eating out of hand. Doesn't ship well because it's got a thin skin. And a couple people tried to turn it into a cider business to kind of save the apples, so to speak. But the California apples, and then there's Washington State apples. I mean, there's apples everywhere, and every type of state or region that has great apples. Carolina, where I am, has a great apple industry on the west side of the state. Cider seems to be the way to go as far as growing the productivity and the profitability of growers, because you can make a whole lot more from selling the liquid version of apples in the form of cider, whether it's hard cider or even fresh pressed cider, than you can by just selling apples by the piece. But and of course, it's not just an American thing. Certainly in France, apple ciders have been a big part of the spirits business there as well. So these are the things I picked up along the way, but mostly I'm no expert. I just like to drink them. When I go someplace, I would, sometimes will prefer to choose the cider on tap than I will the beers on tap, just because I'm feeling it, and especially depending on what I'm eating. So that's a little bit what I wanted to talk about with Jimmy. Are you back, Jim?
can you hear me?
I can now. Great. I've been filling in while we've been waiting for you to get back to give a little background on what we're planning to do. I've got my 3 ciders with me. I've got some cheese with me as well. I recently did a show with the cheese dude, our expert on cheese. We do this shows with him periodically, and we did a whole show on what we call stinky cheeses. And I've got one of those stinky cheeses with me called raclette, which is kind of an alpine, great melting cheese with a Swiss. Well, this one's from Switzerland. It can be made other places. But I've got some of that with me as sort of my palate cleanser, and I've got some crackers, but I've got 3 ciders, and I was hoping maybe you could guide me for how to get the most enjoyment from each one. What are the things I should be looking for based on what you've learned in your shows with the cider guys?
Well, what's exciting about cider, whether it's on a radio show or doing the cider feast events that I do. But first, you asked me how I got into it. Again, it was from being in the business. In 2011, there was a New York State movement to really promote more cider makers in New York State, and it became the first New York Cider Weeks. In my place, Jimmy's number 43, we had a gathering space as well as the restaurant. So we hosted a lot of the first few years of official gatherings, press events, tastings. So I got to know a lot of the people who were already then, working direct from orchards and doing traditional, like, French or English style cider making, and even Spanish. So it's always the thing is to start with style. So one reason I still do all the cider feasts is that in every region, including where you are, in the South, North Carolina, Virginia, up in the hills, there's some great great apples and great terroir for growing apples. A lot of times it overlaps where you can grow wine as well. And in some places, the wine, the wine growers compete with the land for the apples. It really depends on the elevation and things. And I don't know a lot about it, but again, like you, I talked to a lot of the experts. The first thing is you got to taste it. Is a wide range. I like dry ciders. When one of our greats who's still making cider, Steve Wood in Farm Hill in New Hampshire, back in the 70s, he was one of a few people that had an apple orchard and started planting traditional European varieties of apples so that they could make good ciders. And I can't see everything, but and what he was such a purist. He was only making still cider. So you think about a still cider without carbonation, but you realize that it's not everyone's cup of tea. So he, like many other of the really great orchard based, like I always call them fine cider makers. They started making, in 750 wine style bottles, a little bit of sparkling cider. And that's kind of what everybody was going for and still does. I can turn someone on if you have a nice dry cider with a little sparkling to it.
Yeah.
The wine drinker is going to love it. But other people have different palates. There's some cider makers like Graft up in Hudson Valley that do everything from a real classic one called Native, that's dry and sparkling, to others that have different flavors in them. And there's a lot more people who are hybrids between winemakers and cider makers doing co-ferments where they're using different fruits. Like up in Maine, there's one place called Apres, APRES in Portland, drinks. And one of his best ciders, actually, he uses Maine blueberries. And when you think about blueberry, you think it's going to be sweet and blue. Well, you got the blue, but really, as you know, as a chef, blueberries are actually really dry and tart. So to add a little bit of blueberry to an apple cider while it's fermenting, you can get a really classic dry, pretty much apple fruit wine. So there's so many. What's great about it is it's not just the apples like wine; it's the terroir, it's how you make it. So you got original sin. Great friend, Dean on call, one of the pioneers of making cider with other people's apples and being a national brand since 2000. He used to come into bars in New York, and I used to criticize his label because he said it seemed too much like a strip joint. It used to have more of this like burlesque feel. But
There's was a Black Widow spider on the can here and it's called Black Widow. That's the particular type. And so I don't know which is the more jolting, Original Sin or Black Widow spider. But they're going for they're edgy.
With even the apple, so he's edgy. But
Listen, I would hold that one for last if you don't mind, because that's one of the three that I had that's infused with the little blackberry instead of blueberry, as you were describing. But I'd like to maybe start with one of the others, but I need a clarification from you. You used the term dry cider. What is the alternative to dry cider, and what do you mean by dry?
There's levels of dryness. So even it depends again who's making it. If you're working with an orchard based cidery, they might have a sweet cider that is like maybe medium sweet. It's probably closer to champagne where you've got extra dries, sec, demi-sec. None of them should be cloyingly sweet, but you can have a range of sweetness, like some of the English, like Bulmers, some of the English and Irish ciders that are more mass produced have a little bit of sweetness to them. It's partly residual sugar, but it's also mouthfeel. And sometimes those will do really great in the summer at a festival on ice. So there's nothing wrong with putting let's say a more fruity, semi-sweet cider on ice. That's fine. But this is really up to I think dryness really comes down to the taster, because if you go to some Spanish ciders, they some people might think they're acidic or really tart, but then there's ways to, like, so adding a carbonation, or in the case of high pours, lifting it up, and the aeration that you give to that cider when it hits the glass. By aerating it, you're balancing out, you're creating some air molecules that balance it out. But you got to keep doing small glasses of high pours or you catch it off a cask and the cask shoots out. So if you can imagine it, you can taste it. And so ciders really run the whole gamut, just like wine does, of just,
So I guess what I was trying to get at with the sweetness, are you saying that it's really determined that whether it's a dry or a sweet cider is more determined by the apple choice, not by the addition of sugar or something else to it to make it sweeter?
well, and the fermentation. The other day we talked about pizza on Beer Sessions Radio, and you get it. It's the level of fermentation. I don't know how you make a bone dry cider versus a semi sweet. Um, it's all in the fermentation.
So it's kind of like winemaking. It's at the craft of the cider maker, the ciderer, to be able to determine those flavors by the
Yeah,
choice of the type of fermentation. Do they
yeah, and then
do they add yeast like beer makers do to ferment the apple?
again, some do it. There, and I will say this: the good ciders have nothing to do with beer. They're wine. They're fermented like you would wine. The best ciders should be naturally fermented, or there's a select wine, champagne or wine yeast that you're using. It really again depends on the maker. But there's other. I mean, you'll see breweries that'll make a decent drinkable cider for their tap room. And I know one in Allagash Brewing in Portland makes a really good like tap room cider, which becomes a great alternative if you're not a beer drinker. And that's another role that cider can fill. If you have a restaurant, I always go back to, you have a restaurant, you have a wine bar, you've got a couple of taps. You could put on one cider line no matter what, and it's really up to you. Is do you want that to be a more popular style, or do you want to have an esoteric line? And once you have one line of cider, you might find, oh well, we're going to have on a cider more mainstream that's popular. Then we can also bring in small batch local cider as well, rotating through. So, I mean, I always think about the program you're going to do,
Yeah.
when you have a pub or a restaurant.
Well, I'm holding up two ciders right now, and I've talked about contrast. Now, I've never had either of them before. The one from England, the Samuel Smith, is clearly a sweeter cider. It tastes like it's almost like sparkling apple juice with a little bit of alcohol. Whereas this other one, and this is the one from Virginia, I believe. This one is called Potter's Craft Cider, Petite Cider. It's lighter in color, definitely dry. I mean, my mouth is puckering from the dryness of this. I can almost feel like I've eaten a tart apple, and my mouth is starting to pucker up. And it's huge contrast between the two, both equally delicious, wonderful flavors, but a totally different experience.
Yeah, no. Well, let's talk about the Sam Smith first, because th- they they're a great producer of beer, and they also make cider. And you're right, that's kind of like the more of the mainstream pub kind of cider that you're drinking from Sam Smith. It's meant to be an alternative to beer. It's well made. It's got that little fruitiness, kind of a semi-sweet. Again, you could have it. You could have it also on the rocks in the summer. It would be great like that. And that's
It's
great.
one that you can easily drink too much of this. It's sweet and it's going to make you drunk, because
Yeah,
it
and that's
goes down like soda pop.
yeah, and maybe you're a student. If you're a student in England, you might drink that. Over here, you're 21 plus. So you could still be a student.
Right.
That would be an
When I was a kid and I spent a summer in England, I hadn't really I was like 17 years old. Hadn't even had a beer before I went there. My ramp up to it was what they called shandy or shandygraph or sandy.
yeah.
It was basically half beer and half lemon soda. That's what Samuel Smith cider reminds me of, is a shandy.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I can call it an intro cider. It's like if you're going to put it on a list at like again a restaurant wine bar, you could definitely have that cider on. It would be a great way for people to taste it first. But I want to talk about the other one from Virginia.
Yeah.
So basically what we know is that between Virginia and North Carolina, there's regions there that have a history of apple growing. There's a great writer and expert of cider, Dan Pucci from New York. He and his writing partner wrote a great book. It's called American Cider, and it came out about 4 years ago. And he's covered every region in America that had traditional apple cider growing and making. And there's one in North Carolina called James Creek that is up there with world-class, wine style dry ciders. I haven't tried it yet. I've only had them on the radio show when we did the Pig's Book about 4 years ago. And Foggy Ridge was also one of those top ciders out of Virginia. And she's got a great book, Diane Flint. She's actually stopped making cider, but they grow the apples and other cider makers. So you never know. There's some good fruit in Virginia and North Carolina. And I don't know which apples they are. Does it say on the can?
Let me see. Just says Virginia apples. But I can tell you this, I'm enjoying it more now because I just took a piece of cheese, and after I ate my piece of cheese, I took a sip of the cider and I tasted the nuances of the apples a lot more. What is the deal with cheese and apples? Why it goes together so well. It's like synergy. It's the real food synergy. It makes everything taste.
So when you're into a really good dry cider, it sounds like that's what you're drinking. It's right up there with the craze for natural wine. You've got some funkiness, you've got a dryness, and sometimes you need that food pairing to balance it. Yeah, and that's really kind of, you walk about my quest, the food and drink in hand that go together. I want to drink something that tastes better with my food and vice versa, which also leads to a simplicity. If you've got this simple, dry, you might call it tart. How did you describe the taste of the cider again before you tried the cheese?
Like it was like eating a really a tart apple, where your inside of your mouth puckers up, and you feel like your lips curling.
And then now with the cheese, how does it taste?
With the cheese, it gets right past all of that, and it goes right to just like the essence of apple that's coming through. But it's not like hitting you over the head apple like the English cider, but it's like this very delicate kind of finish, an apple finish that's very, very pleasant.
Yeah, and with that Samsonite cider, you probably don't need to eat with it. You can just drink it. It's funny.
Exactly.
You talk about how fat, fat balances what's in your mouth and what you're
Yeah.
drinking. When I was a kid, my dad used to always dunk. He had coffee and he would dunk his buttered toast in it. And I think as I got older, I started doing something. And I was recently talking to someone who says he actually puts a piece of butter in his coffee.
Yeah, I hear that's becoming kind of a thing now. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I never knew why, but that now it starts to make sense as we talk about it this way.
Yeah, somehow the fat, but balances out the butter, the bitterness. Um, it's amazing. I mean, that's food science. I know you know more about it than I knew.
Like you said, food pairing is when we eat, we want to be able to enjoy our food, and not just rush through it and get the sort of the first hit, but the depth of what's in there, or as we teach our bread making students to evoke the full potential of flavor that's trapped in those ingredients. And sometimes the right combination of things brings out nuances and flavors that you don't get if you just eat it by itself. And I think
Yeah.
that's why people love to drink wine and have beer with their food. Before we run out of time, though, I want to get into this original sin. This is the blackberry, but they call it black widow because it's got blackberries in it. You can see that it's also got a nice rosé-ish kind of tint, or it looks like a very light Pinot Noir. And talk about sort of, again, the range of dry to sweet. This one kind of goes right down the middle between the two.
Yeah, I mean, Guido Call, Original Sin. I would just say that you have to give him a lot of credit. He makes really good ciders, and they're popular, and they move, and he's in at least 30 states. He also has an orchard in New York State where he does make some batches of New York State only, but he does source his. That's the other thing, you're bigger. He does source grapes from different parts of the country as well. Great maker. How's the cheese taste with that?
Well, try it right now.
Yeah, because then I'm gonna go back to something you told me the other day about pizza.
Same thing. The fruit aspect of the cider becomes more pronounced when your mouth is filled with the fat of the cheese.
Yeah. So the other day when you were on my show, Beer Sessions Radio, you said, when you're first going into a place to try that pizza, you always try the margarita because it just as a basic. And then you've told that story, but I'm going to tell you now how I spin that to cider. Why I love cider, your experience with that dry cider from Virginia, yeah, and the way it transformed by eating that cheese. For me, you've just reached the penultimate of food and drink pairing. There's no better than that. And I don't need to go ahead and try it with three different cheeses. You've already found it, and that's my simple quest in life. Why I was looking for the good lunch. I just want something that I want to eat. I don't need to go and have an intellectual exercise and try 3 or 6 different cheeses now and see what's better. Yeah, that's how I feel about it. If the cider's that good with a piece of cheese, you found that's your mouth. You found your mouth.
Yeah. Well, I have to say, I'm loving this Black Widow infused cider with the blackberry because you know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of a really good what's the Belgian beer with fruits?
Lambic.
It's like
Yeah,
a
lambic, you
it
probably
reminds me
turn
of
on the creek. Yeah, the creek that has more of the fruit in it. There's other lambics that are completely bone dry.
yeah, yeah, but the lambics that my ramp up to lambics, my beginners lambics were always more fruity, and
Yeah,
and it works. Like, again, the combination of the fruit and the sourdough fermentation and everything else. But that's what this reminds me of, because it has the effervescence, it has the fruit, and it has a little bit of kick at the end, and it's medium dry. I'd say if I had to rate these based on the little bit that I've learned today from you, I would put that in the middle between the two extremes of these three ciders.
yeah. Well, if you want to, shout out the lambics. I know Lindemans again. It's also the same importer as Sam Smith. That's the intro lambic. Then that you might add the Lindemans Creek. They have Lindemans Framboise, which is raspberry. Again, back when I opened Jimmy's number 43, the Lindemans would fly out because it was the fruited sours. Again, you can't just all these things we talk about, good pizza and fermentation. All these things take time. A lot of craft brewers in America, there's ways to make a quick sour the same way that there's ways to knock out a cider. But to do it right, you have to take time, and it starts with good fruit. And the technique a lot of times, it's there's got to be sanitation, but you know, you're not making a factory product. And when you do, you have to change the recipe. I saw that with some great brewers that started small, and you uh, they were world class beers, but to grow to that scale of production, they have to change the recipe. And then they might have to say, well, we have this quirky pilsner, but we have to bring in a guy from Germany that's brewed 100-barrel batches so that we can actually make it, and it's
Right.
proper. You can't just take a small batch recipe. This, you can't scale up your small batch recipe. You have to actually start with a big recipe, and tweak it.
Yeah.
I don't know if you feel that way in baking. I know you said you grew your bakery in the early days, but it must have been the same, right? I mean, you couldn't just take your homemade bread and make more of it.
Well, obviously when you're working in larger amounts, you have to control the fermentation much more closely and everything else. And I think it's true with, beer and bread are just so similar that we always say beer is just liquid bread and bread is solid beer. And I think you could say that about the ciders. In fact, let me sort of like tie this all together with one quick anecdote. Um, a few years ago, I was enamored with cherry ciders. There were some cherry ciders coming out. I was living in California at the time, so we're talking about 25 years ago. And I also was making sourdough bread a lot. Well, sometimes if you let your sourdough starter sit in the refrigerator for like a week or so, it starts to separate, and the alcohol that's in that sourdough starter rises to the top, and it creates this grayish liquid that we call hooch. And hooch is the alcohol byproduct of sourdough fermentation. Um, and I got this idea one time of skimming off the hooch from my sourdough starter and pouring it into my cherry cider. And and basically I spiked my cherry cider, so I upped the alcohol amount, but also I gave it that sourdough, sort of tint that made it really taste like a lambic. In fact, I felt I had created an instant. You talk about quick lambics. This was a quick instant lambic beer. Made in kind of reverse engineered, going from the cider first to the beer rather than going from the beer to the to the cider. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you because I thought it's been one of my favorite sort of stumble upon food discoveries of all time. Every once in a while, when I have some of that hooch left in my sourdough starter, I skim it off and use it to spike my. It's because really it's grain alcohol. When you think about it, it's just grain alcohol, and when you add it to your anything, to your beer, to your wine, whatever. But I wouldn't add it to wine, but I'd add it to beer, and
I have another sourdough story for you. So I have no patience. I've never kept a sourdough starter more than 2 weeks. Never could even start a batch of vinegar. I would forget about it and it would dry up. But I have a friend who's a cook, and she's always got a sourdough starter. And years ago, I remember being at her house, and she showed me. So first, she had the sourdough starter, so of course she was always making bread, and she used it every day. But then she skimmed off whatever this excess liquid was. She made like a scallion pancake for me on the spot. She would make like little crackers, or she called them wine crackers on the spot.
Right.
She was basically like, I have to use this. I use it every day, and it's amazing. I had never really thought of all the things you could do with the starter. That's right. So many of us, it's like, oh, let's make a dough and we're hobbyists. We'll make a batch of bread once a year. That's the camp I'm in. So.
You're right. Well, and so are many, many others. Well, Jimmy, it's been great having you on the show. I want to again remind our listeners to tune in to Beer Sessions Radio with host Jimmy Carbone. 15 years on the air. Yeah, always new shows. How often do you post new shows? About once a week, once every couple of weeks?
We're about once a week. Maybe we're on pace now to do about 40 a year. Different themes. Cider. We're going to a beer bar by the time your show comes out. Then we'll be at a beer bar in Boston, talking with a food writer.
So for people that want to follow you, if they want to follow you and find out where you are, if they want to attend it, they can go to Heritage Radio. But you also have like an Instagram?
Yeah, you can follow me at Jimmy Pots and Pans or at beer_sessions. That you'll find out.
Yeah.
We're always out there. Boston.
Jimmy's Pots and Pans. It's kind of your moniker, so to speak. Your
Jimmy Pots and Pans. Yeah, you can find that at Jimmy Pots and Pans. And there's a story to that. When I had my first restaurant, Muggsy's Chow Chow, there was one customer. He walked in and started calling me Jimmy Pots and Pans, and it stuck. And I had no idea where that came from. And then when I had my first email, I was Jimmy Pots and Pans at whatever. And later on, I found out that he wasn't that original. At the time, I guess there was a tomato sauce in the supermarket called Joey Pots and Pans. Yeah. It sounds pretty cool. If I knew that, I would have said, stop calling me that. So,
maybe you've outlived Joey's Pots and Pans and now Jimmy's Pots and Pans.
I don't want to say anything. I never even heard about him after that. So yeah,
right. You put him out of business. Jimmy, it's been great having you on. Thank you so much for sharing all of your knowledge and the passion and joy that you feel after all these years of doing it, meeting really cool people and doing what you love. And that's, I think, what really comes through, in your podcast and in all your work and in our conversation. So we're looking forward to doing this again and maybe continuing to collaborate as we find new ways to do it.
Well, thanks, Peter. You're really teaching us a lot as well. So thanks so much and great meeting you, brother. Thank you.
Same here. Folks, thank you so much for joining us. We've been with Jimmy Carbone. We'll see you on the next episode of Pizza Quest, and keep hanging in there. Go to Beer Sessions Radio, where you can hear Jimmy's ongoing shows, and come back to pizzaquest.com. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time.